Hello and welcome to episode 2 of season 3 of the Experience Lounge podcast. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back. This is our first official video recording. So, let's pray to the technology gods that this works. But if it does, brilliant. So this is the first time you'll see us, I think, on YouTube. That's probably where we're going to post this, and maybe on LinkedIn and our other social channels, which if you're following us, you'll see we've been upping the posts and content a lot, haven't we? Social media gurus we are. Anyway, lovely to have you all here with us. Laura, how are you doing?
I am good. It's been a busy week. I think I'm still in the getting up to speed in the new role. So work-wise, it's been pretty full on. I've got a long weekend planned, which is nice. Some of our friends from Singapore are over, so I'm taking the day off on Monday and really looking forward to seeing them because we've not seen them for a while. So yeah, it'll be a nice relaxing weekend. How about you?
Yeah, hopefully the same. So it's Chinese New Year here. So if you're listening, happy Lunar New Year if you're celebrating. I've got like a little plushie behind me. Can you see it? This little lion.
Year of the Tiger, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yes. So really getting into it. And so, long weekend for us here. So we don't go back to work until next Thursday, which is lovely. So I've got a few activities planned, mainly centered around the dog. So we're going tomorrow to Lazarus Island. Did you ever go when you were here?
I did. I went. It was actually when we sort of knew we were moving back. I made a sort of a bucket list of things that I wanted to see before we went or re-see. And yeah, Lazarus Island was the one I hadn't been to. It was really good. Nice. It made you feel a bit like you were. I wouldn't go so far as to say Bali-esque, but not Singapore, if you know what I mean, in terms of sort of the busyness of the city.
Yeah, it's really nice. So we're going to take the dog over there for the first time, which should be super cute. And then taking him to a dog water park on Sunday. I sound like a crazy dog woman, which I am, but you've got to plan activities around him. So yeah, other than that, lots of other fun things as well going on, but hopefully it's a good weekend for everybody. So, but yeah, nice. And so you're settling into your job role, but any house updates, any tester updates?
No tester updates. The car did get its own update, as it does in the way that they release some of it like a mobile phone, which was a bit fun before Christmas because it had all these flashing lights that do tester against our house. But house-wise, very exciting. Our mortgage offer got approved yesterday, so that means providing anyone that's bought a house in the UK would know it can be a lengthy process. So providing it goes through with all the solicitors and stuff. We're good. So I'm excited. I'll be moving out of the in-laws hopefully I'm hoping by the end of March we can do it like in the first quarter of the year. So it'll be nice to have our own space, and I'm sure that they will be glad to see the back of us as well.
Fingers crossed. And then you're going to set up like your own podcast studio in your new gaff, right?
Oh yeah. That is exactly what I'm going to do, and a little gym as well.
Yeah, a little gym for your Peloton, and we could get like matching neon signs in the background that say the Experience Lounge.
Absolutely. We want to get merch, don't we? That's what we were saying is the next plan. So if people are going to start watching us on video, we've both made an effort today to put on some makeup and stuff. And having the merch would be pretty cool as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, full disclosure, pre-agreeing to go on video for this podcast, we used to come on and look awful most of the time. Well, I say that. I looked awful most of the time. Never put makeup on, always looked a little bit scruffy, but that's fine. So it's nice to get back into the routine of wearing makeup, actually, because we're not in the office, so I don't really wear makeup that much anyway, but, it's nice to dress up.
It is. Yes. And for me, I'm not a morning person, so we always record now on a Friday first thing. So I'm always, I do feel bad. I'm always texting you being like, I'm going to be 10 minutes late.
No, you're fine. Don't worry about it. I'm sure everyone appreciates the few extra minutes we have.
Exactly.
Right. Let's get into today's episode then. So today we're going to be talking about making internal moves a better experience. So the concept of internal mobility, it's one when Laura and I were going through our planning process, we both kind of said, this tends to be one that's overlooked. We talk a lot about the onboarding process, but very little about that internal mobility experience. So when you're moving from one position to another, as you have just done, Laura, actually, either within the same function or into a different function as well. So we wanted to talk a little bit about why this is such an important experience and what you can do to design it in a way that is a little bit more employee centric. So hopefully super relevant, especially for those of you that are maybe centering your employee experience strategies around retention and kind of tackling the great resignation, especially if it's hitting your organizations pretty hard. But before we get into that, as we usually do, here are a few HR tech news updates. And actually, these aren't really HR tech news updates today. They're slightly different, which hopefully everyone will appreciate. So first one, which I thought was quite nice, especially, well, not nice, it's actually really awful, but one that follows on quite nicely from our previous episode on project failures, is there was some news published in Forbes this week about a pay apocalypse at Google. So it sounds like they went through some kind of payroll re-implementation or technology change. But here's a snippet from the article. So it says, some Google employees found that their entire first paycheck of the year had been sent into their retirement accounts due to a technical error, according to Bloomberg. What one employee dubbed Paypocalypse 2022 in the latest high-profile payroll mistake. And then there's a few other bits here as to how Google responded. But I just thought it was really interesting because this is our worst nightmare, isn't it? This would be the worst.
Yeah. And I think it's because when we talk a lot about employee experience, we're often talking about some of those kind of key moments that matter. And for me, getting paid is, if you think of your sort of hierarchy of needs at work, that is the basic one, right? Is most people would perhaps enjoy their roles, but you would go because you want to get paid. So for that to then not happen is obviously the sort of the biggest no-no.
Yeah, exactly. So second news story here is actually it's a report that I just kind of wanted to shed some light on, and I will leave the links for everyone listening, is talking about fast feedback fueling performance. So it's a Gallup research paper, and it says employees are hungry for feedback from their leaders, managers and peers. They want to gain insights that advance their abilities and future potential. Just jumping ahead of it, it says Gallup data shows that when employees strongly agree they received meaningful feedback in the past week, so the past week is a proximity here, they are almost 4 times more likely than other employees to be engaged. So this just really goes to show like this kind of, I think we've all moved away from the annual performance cycle most of the time, but this kind of performance feedback loop being more regular is just so important. What do you think, Laura?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's that real philosophy of in the moment feedback that then means it's tangible and actionable. Because I think what you sort of used to see in organizations is that you'd have the annual performance review and people would kind of save up that window to send out all of their feedback requests, whether that was like on a platform that you might use from a tech perspective or over email. And I think what ended up happening was people would get loads and loads of requests, which therefore, if you're going to get loads, it probably dilutes what you're going to put in for somebody. And then secondly, if it's not specifically about a sort of a project that you've been working on or a piece of work, then actually you end up with quite generic, like Laura's a nice person. It's not anything actionable. So I think that in the moment feedback, when it's related to something really specific, is that view of aggregated performance, I think, which is then I think going to lead to that sort of hyper performance, is that you're able to make those sort of small tweaks as you go, and then you perform better overall.
Yeah, totally agree. So there you go. Meaningful feedback is frequent feedback, and I loved this tagline in the report as well. Effective feedback has an expiration date, which I think is really cool. So that's it. Just a couple of highlights today, a short news update. And so let's jump into the topic today. So internal mobility, internal moves, how we make that a better experience. So first topic, why does internal mobility matter? Like, why is this an imperative for organizations, and why, as EX practitioners or HR practitioners listening, should we care about this? What do you think?
I think we talked about it a little bit in our previous episode. There's a backdrop at the moment in terms of the Great Resignation, and there is a lot of research actually that disengagement of employees can cost companies millions and millions of dollars, up to 60 million a year actually, and that replacing an employee can cost up to 2 times the employee's salary. So there's a definite kind of cost element to it. I also think there's a sort of EVP branding element actually as well, in the sense of, if you sort of see a mass exodus of people leaving the organisation, and I think we're quite familiar with platforms like Glassdoor, where people will kind of rate that experience externally of their employers. I think that has a massive potential to have impact on your EVP and then your ability to attract talent. I think there's also the piece about knowledge and sort of retention of that knowledge, particularly if people are doing roles that are quite specialist. And I do think, though, there's something about, when is it the right time for people to perhaps move internally, or when is it the right time for them to leave the organisation, with a view that they could always come back. So I think when you think about that sort of with talent moves within an organisation, it is sort of assessing what can that employee give to the organisation, what can the organisation give back to them, and sort of looking at, I think, the longer term strategy of, it could be beneficial that person goes away, works in another part of the organisation, or works outside the organisation and comes back and brings that sort of that skill set. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with everything that you said. I would echo, I think we really overlook the value of retaining knowledge within the organization, and not even just kind of knowledge as it relates to the role you're executing, but just knowledge of kind of how to navigate the landscape, who to influence, who are your big stakeholders, those really key things, and being able to keep that and move that around the organization depending on, if there's new projects elsewhere, or, you're opening new parts of the business. I think it's really, really important. So I definitely think that is a huge part of internal mobility. I think the other thing is around that retention piece. If I go into an organization, or if I were to go into an organization, I want to know that there's an opportunity for me to move, not only going to another organization, but being able to step into a new opportunity if I fall in love with working at that organization. So I think, you can't be inspired by something you can't see. You can't get excited about a role that you can't apply for, or you can't see other people moving into as well. So I think, when an organization makes a promise like, we care about our people, we want to develop our people, I think part of it is that providing development resources and opportunities, but actually it's about that career piece and providing that next step and providing coaching to move into that next step. So I just think it's so important from a retention perspective and that attraction piece, because I'm sure there are people that will look at organizations and see, is there somewhere I can stay if I choose to do so? So I think it's super important. And I think, again, we kind of touched on this beforehand. It's a process that we've overlooked, and maybe it's because volumes aren't necessarily there, because so often when people move, they move on to another organization. But I certainly think this is one that we need to get right. And, it's also really risky for organizations if they move a great person into a role where they're not thriving, because you'll lose them then. And I would love to look at, like, a data question here, but what is the average tenure once someone moves into a new role within the organization, and what are the driving factors of them leaving if they do leave? It would be really interesting to see. What do you think?
I think it would be super, super interesting, because I think that there's definitely the piece around when people do move internally, and I know we're sort of going to cover this in the next bit of the episode, how do organizations support them, particularly I think if it's a talent move that's perhaps into a role that's a bit different to what they might have done previously. I think that sort of how do you support people? Because I think so often we focus on the onboarding experience when people join us externally, and we've talked quite a bit previously about experiences where employees might have some time out of the workplace, i.e. if you go on maternity leave, and we talk about sort of onboarding people back into the organization then. But actually I do think there is something about how do you make that transition more seamless and don't necessarily just leave people up to their own devices. Because I think there's probably a crucial period of sort of, the kind of 30, 60, 90 days where it does feel a bit like when you're joining a new role or sort of new organisation. And I think you have similar feelings actually to what you would have if you were joining an organisation externally as well. And I almost think that view of trying to treat it like you're being onboarded into a new role is probably I don't think loads of organisations will do it, but I think it probably is the way to look at it from an experience perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just while you were talking about that, I imagine there's, kind of a psychological element here of people that have been with the organization for a long time, moving into a new role, with new hires, they're able to ask questions. They're able to be somewhat vulnerable about not knowing everything or being confused or, needing some help. And so I wonder if there's an element of not being comfortable to ask for that when you are moving internally because you have all of these years of experience. And there's kind of this assumption or expectation that you're just going to thrive as soon as you get in there. But maybe we can cover that one when we talk about that kind of human-centered design element and how can we maybe get out and ask people for that feedback. So moving on to topic 2, what does a great experience look like? What would a really good internal mobility process look like? And so I thought I'd start with a bit of research from HBR, and again, we'll share the links here. But essentially, just to kind of call out a few quotes here. So Gartner surveys indicate that a full 49% of people promoted within their own companies are underperforming up to 18 months after those moves. And McKinsey reports that 27% to 46% of executives who transition are regarded as failures or disappointments 2 years later. They have the right skills and experience. They understand the company's goals. They've been vetted for cultural fit. So why didn't they quickly excel in their new roles? Just jumping ahead, only 43% of people surveyed in 2021 by the Institute of Corporate Productivity, who even knew that existed, said their organizations ensured that transitioning employees were onboarded with guidance and support. So 43% said that they were supported. Only about a quarter said their employees encouraged transitioners to build connections early or create networks to address skills gaps. And I guess the entire sentiment with this bit of research, this article here, is that the key to setting someone up for success is ensuring they have access to the right networks. So that's really interesting, and I think certainly something that both of us can relate to, having moved internally. So with that in mind, what do you think makes a good experience, Laura?
So I think the bit of that research that was quite interesting that I'd want to touch on as well is when you do have a scenario where somebody has actually been promoted, because obviously through hopefully through the process of moving into that role, they, as that article had said, they have been vetted in terms of they do have the skills and capability to operate at that level. But I do think there's something about organizations sometimes assume, I think, that people are just then going to move into that role and that's sort of it. So I do think there's something about how are we sort of supporting that transition, both if it is sort of a lateral move in terms of the same level, but also actually if it is a promotion and the expectation is that they need to operate at a different level, that there is the right level of support in place. And some of what I think that looks like is it is sort of helping to facilitate mentoring and coaching relationships. And again, I think it's a bit remiss to sort of assume that people would be able to do that themselves. I think largely a lot of employees would be able to go out and find a mentor, but I think the question is, are they the right mentor for the purpose of transitioning into a new role? So I think what organizations can do is help with that sort of mentoring relationship and sort of help employees to find who would be an appropriate mentor or coach to help with some of that transition. I think being partnered in that kind of mentoring way with somebody that perhaps has already gone through that transition or has worked in that role previously, I think could be a really a great sounding board for that individual in the new role. And I think it's probably linked similarly to a sort of buddy program concept as well. It's basically saying that you've got a network of people that you can go to and talk through some of the challenges and sort of questions that you might have, that, like you said before, you might not feel as comfortable saying perhaps to your new people leader, line manager, or those around you. So I think the sort of support network is really, really key as sort of the first one. The other is actually that kind of reinvention of the probation period for internal moves. And I say that because I don't even know how many organisations actually would have a probationary period for internal moves. But sort of rebranding that, I think, to look at that as a way that you would support colleagues through that transition and have a really open and honest conversation about how things are doing. And I think that's important in the sense of it also goes two-way, because it's not just whether the organisation thinks that the individual is performing in that new role, it's also, is that new role what the individual was expecting it to be? And I think that sort of real honest conversation in terms of, actually, these are things that I think might be working, these are things that I think might not be working. I think that sort of conversation is really valuable, rather than, which the article I think was sort of saying, is you get 12, 18, 24 months down the line and somebody turns around and goes, actually, that's not the right person for the role. And it's like, well, we could have done a heap of interventions during that time in order to support them. So they're just a couple of thoughts for me. What about you, Sasha?
I agree, and just to build on that as well. So, maybe this is an idea for another episode. I actually think there's a call to reinvent the entire concept of a probationary period, to be honest with you, just because I think it's slightly archaic, because, when we talk about the probationary period, it's so one-sided. It's the company deciding whether someone is the right fit. But actually, the reality is, more so today than ever, it's also a trial period for employees. So how can you reframe that in a way that it's more engaging and, I think, more personal and kind of, I don't know, more meaningful as well. But yes, to come back to your point around that kind of buddy-ish program, making sure people have access to the right networks, I agree. And I think from an experience perspective, getting someone hooked up with their buddy or their contact in that new network as early as possible is really important. So I know that often the buddy program happens for new hires as soon as you kind of come on board day one onwards, but actually bringing that forward for internals just means they're able to kind of feel a bit more comfortable, ask more questions, kind of try and get settled before the move officially takes place. So I think from an experience perspective, if you're thinking about introducing that as kind of a formal process, trying to do that early on, I think is really effective. And actually it kind of can cover over what is normally a bit of a long admin process. So whilst you're waiting for the official paperwork, you can go ahead and get started building those relationships to kind of make you feel a bit more comfortable. I think this is a bit of a shout out to an analytics platform I love, Panelit. So I've done some work with Panelit before, but they play exactly in this space around relational analytics. So their platform looks at how are teams interacting with each other and who are the biggest influencers in those organizations. And so if you had a platform like Panelit looking at those relational analytics, you would be able to pinpoint who is the person in the function someone's moving into or the team that someone's moving into that is going to set them up for success. And it will be the person that has the most connections, the person that is most frequently connected to the right people that person also needs to be integrated with. And so I think something like that, it would be amazing, obviously, if you could invest in something like that, but that might be a slightly longer term one. And I think the other thing I would add, and it'd be good to get your views on this, is coaching for managers, both the manager letting go of someone and the manager receiving a new employee into their team. Just because I think it's an awkward one. I think there's just awkward feel around people leaving anyway, let alone if they're staying in the organization. So I think a bit of coaching either side would also help make it a better experience. What do you think?
Agree. And I also think a bit of a build on that is when you're internally leaving one role and going into the other. I think it can be so much harder to be able to let go of some of that old role, if you like, and then more seamlessly transition into the new role.
Yeah.
And I think that is, for me, one of the biggest differences about leaving an organization and joining a new organization versus a role internally. And I think we do need to provide more support to managers, and I think, you know, through coaching is sort of one avenue in order to try and help make that transition as smooth as possible, because I do think sometimes you're not setting somebody up for success actually if they're still being expected to hold on to chunks of previous role, and then move into the new one. And I think that's things like making sure that you've got backfills in place for the old role, so people are sort of coming in and taking over those pieces of work so that that new person really is set up for success. And I think also, in the same way that you sometimes see people leave an organization, if they can maybe take a few weeks off to sort of reflect, then get your energy levels up and ready to move into the new role. How is it that organizations could facilitate some of that? Because I think what you're doing, if you're not thinking about that transition sort of more holistically, you're then actually, you're sort of just not setting somebody up for success. And therefore I think no surprise that some of those articles are saying actually in 12 months time the person wasn't performing how I thought they would. And that's, it's kind of like, well, yeah, because they were carrying all that stuff. There wasn't a proper transition. The managers didn't talk to each other, you know, and so you can see why those things may then happen if it's not sort of managed in the right way, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if more so at a senior level as well, there's some work to do around branding internal moves and thinking about how they're announced to the business in a way that enables that transition more seamlessly. So looking at, you know, how do we announce this so that someone can let go of that stuff? You know, I wonder if that's a part of it as well. So like if you're thinking about the kind of end-to-end process that someone will go through, all that life cycle of, you know, how do we announce it to the business? What's the communication element of that to enable them to be successful? Because you're totally right. When you leave an organization, you close that laptop and you're like, do you know what, Lisa in accounts, I don't care anymore and I don't have to care anymore. Whereas when you're an internal, you can't just ignore them. You can't delete your emails or move over. And I think that's something that we'll never, I don't think there's any, you know, there's no way of getting rid of that unless you work in a really transactional role, which is probably more junior, where you can hand off to someone completely. But I think there's probably more creative and structured ways of making that easier. So yeah, no, I think it's a really, really interesting point. I also think simple, but documenting what that process looks like is really key. I think we do a great job of doing that for onboarding. So most organizations have a here's your onboarding journey. But for internal moves, that's kind of lacking. So, you know, having that and also publicizing that internally on your internal job site as well, I think might help to remove some of the anxiety from your internal applicants about what does this look like for me, and, you know, how am I going to be able to manage that alongside my other roles? So I certainly think there's a benefit to doing that. What do you reckon?
Yeah, definitely. I think it sort of lays out then more clearly expectations from all sides. So from, you know, the employee moving from their old role into the new one, but also, like we talked about, that sort of transition for managers as well, because I think that is so key for them to get that experience right. And also, actually, we sort of haven't talked about, but sometimes also then the impact of the people who are in the team of the individual moving, because often actually they're the most impacted in terms of if that transition isn't sort of managed very well. Are they sort of then with the manager who's moving, who can't give all the people in their previous team all the time that they need, but actually they're trying to sort of set themselves up for success in the new role. So I do think there's definitely a need to sort of document that and make that more clear, I think, for lots of different sort of stakeholders, I suppose, in the process.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Cool. All right. So topic 3, before we wrap up, what employee experience design or human-centered design methodologies can organizations use to improve their internal mobility experience? So apart from kind of absorbing ideas and a little bit of brainstorming, what do you think people can do, Laura?
I would say our sort of usual approach that we often talk about. So the key thing is going to talk to employees that have gone through that process, because I think, as with a lot of the human-centered design techniques and what we focus on in EX, it's understanding that employee lens. Because I think if we don't do that, it has the potential for this to be a sort of a process that kind of HR design based on what they think, as opposed to kind of going and talking to people that have been through that process. And I also think talking to employees at a range of levels across the organization, because I think there will be differences probably in your experience based actually on the seniority. And I say that because it's the expectations, the nature of the role. And I also think, where we sort of mentioned before, you've got people that might be making a lateral move, i.e. it's into the same sort of grade, or where people have been promoted, because I think there's different things that sort of are factors at play that, when you're sort of designing what that experience could look like, need to be factored in. And then probably the other one, which we're seeing increasingly more now with the sort of concept of a gig economy and people having multiple careers in their lifetime, is also how do we manage the seamless transition. And again, I would say, sort of talking to employees about this, where people are perhaps moving to a completely different role. So they might have worked in sort of one area of the business for some time, and then they're moving to another part of the business. And that in itself can be a fantastic talent opportunity to bring a different way of thinking, a different skill set. But you've got to be really mindful of what then is the impact to that employee, and making sure they feel supported, they don't feel, too much out of their depth. And so talking to employees, I think, that have been through that process will then help, as an organisation, you to sort of craft the right guidance and sort of approach that will then support them in the way that they need to be supported. So that, I think that's probably a big one. What about you?
Yeah, I also think, slightly off topic a bit here, but this, and we've spoken about this before, internal mobility, we've spoken a lot about during this episode, moving from one role to another. But I think we're also, when we talk about internal mobility, it's about opportunity mobility and giving people opportunities to work on something in a different function or trial something new. And I think that is a really powerful strategy and would probably help to minimize the risks of moving someone into a role permanently where maybe they haven't trialed something. And so I think a combination of two, so getting this particular experience of moving permanently into a new role right, along with affording people the opportunity to test the waters a bit through, platforms like Gloat that we've spoken about before, democratizing internal development opportunities using technology will also help de-risk that. But anyway, I've totally digressed. That is not the question we're answering. Other thing I would say is starting small. And I think we talked about this in the last season as well, is it doesn't need to be like a wholesale months and months of work here. It could be as simple as pulling together a checklist. It could be as simple as a guidance email or document to managers to help make the transition better. So I think once you've done that research piece and you can identify the kind of top 3-4 pain points, tackle them one by one. You don't need to do it all in one go. So I definitely say that. And I think that sits nicely into that kind of prototyping, piloting part of the design thinking process. So yeah, that would be my advice.
And I think probably one last point too, which we touched on when you were talking with Panellit and sort of organisation network analysis, but is also looking at your data. So where you can see, for example, where people do move, what's the retention of people in those roles? Yeah. So are you seeing a trend, for example, where people leave after 6-12 months? And that would give you, I think, an indication of, well, there's actually something wrong here in terms of the, that transition. So I think that piece around your kind of people analytics and data insights are obviously going to be really, really key, I think, in sort of mapping out where are some of those hotspots. And probably the other thing I'd say is a bit linked to the starting small is think about whether there is benefit in adopting things like a pulse survey. So, perhaps you pulse people 30, 60, 90 days into that new role, and just do a sense check of, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, like, how are you feeling about the role? And that may even give you enough insight to then think, actually, we've got to tweak some things here in order to either stop that person from perhaps leaving the organisation, or just to sort of tweak the overall experience, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And even before it gets to kind of attrition, looking at, if you've got a tool like Qualtrics or something similar, intent to stay, so you're able to kind of intercept before people make the move. So you're kind of seeing, is that intent to stay decreasing after a second role? So I think that would be really interesting. But awesome, cool. We're at time. That is a full episode. Hopefully lots of kind of interesting ideas for people, and would love to hear as well, because we don't hear this kind of spoken about much in the kind of public sphere of employee experience. If someone's done something really cool and they've seen it work really well, or if you've moved as part of your organization and it's been an amazing experience, would love to know what made that an amazing experience, so we can definitely shout that out in another episode. So
yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
Well, so we can say, as always, we what you said, we're up in the socials, so do like, rate, subscribe on whatever podcast app, or if you watch this obviously on YouTube as well now. But we've also got an Instagram handle, which is the Experience Lounge Podcast. And we also have a LinkedIn page, the Experience Lounge. So do go and check it out, because that's how you'll get all the updates on what we're recording. Our attempts at stories and reels.
Tragic.
So exactly. You'll get to see some of that.
Two aging women trying not to age. That's what we're like. Trying our best with reels, though. So go ahead and check them out. But thank you all so much for watching or listening, and we will be back next week with episode 3. Have a great weekend.
See you then. Bye.
Bye.